The poem was written in 1963. At that time Africa was in the middle of a decolonization process. This poem refers to the Mau Mau uprising in Kenya. It is important to note that the poet does not have any real roots in Africa. The poem is written from the perspective of a person looking at the situation from a distance. Probably looking at photos in newspapers. He seems to have an objective viewpoint. Let's watch a newsreel from the 1960s.
In the East African British colony of Kenya, there appeared to be little prospect for any sort of self-government. Unlike Ghana, which had few European settlers, Kenya's fertile soil and comfortable climate had attracted several thousand Europeans during the 1920s and 30s. They took over much of the land and used Africans as servants and laborers. Thousands of British citizens came to stay, to enjoy a life they could never afford in Britain. 4 million acres of land were taken from the largest tribe, the Kikuyu. At first, their case was argued by Jomo Kenyatta, who led a popular movement to demand their land back and negotiate self-rule. When the British refused to budge, some Kikuyu formed a secret organization. They lived off the land in the forest under Mount Kenya and called themselves a Land and Freedom Army, the Mau Mau. Waiwaturi joined them.
I joined Mau Mau because of the hardship. The main problem was that our land had been taken by the white man. Then there was education. The schools we used to go to were closed down and destroyed. So we all came together into groups and took an oath. The African was your brother. But when you see a white man, you should know he is your enemy.
To Africans, the Mau Mau were freedom fighters. But to the Europeans, they were terrorists.
For it is that band of fanatics whose bloody deeds have cast a dark shadow across the face of Kenya.
The British used the police and army to round up suspects from the Kikuyu villages. They dropped 50,000 tons of bombs to try to destroy their camps. The Mau Mau who tried to shoot down the British planes were celebrated as folk heroes. The Mau Mau concluded there was no alternative to violence. They used homemade weapons to terrorize European settlers, attacking isolated farmhouses and police stations. Derek and Sylvia Richardson had settled in the Highlands 20 years earlier.
We were a bit isolated, even more isolated than we are now. But we used to have our guns with us all the time, our revolvers.
The Richardsons' neighbors were among the few to survive an attack. 2 women living alone, they were glorified in British newsreels.
There was a bang on the door. They opened it. This gang came rushing in. And Kitty and Dot shot at these people and killed 2 of them. And they shot quite a number of bullets. One of them killed their dog, which of course was heartbreaking for them because they were devoted to it.
Many Africans opposed the violence, including Jomo Kenyatta. Despite a lack of evidence, he was accused of Mau Mau links and imprisoned. 80,000 suspects were detained and interrogated, including Wangugu Gichunga.
Mtu anaitwa pale kwa Rain, maana wamekuja wanakuja moja moja.
We would all be in a line. They'd call the detainees one by one.
Unajua Mau Mau? No.
Are you Mau Mau? No.
Wewe umekula kiapo?
Have you taken an oath?
Hapa.
No.
Unaweza fanya nini?
What will you do if we send you home?
Hakuna?
Nothing.
Kuna kitu. Sema.
Tell us if you are Mau Mau.
On the edge of the African jungle in Kenya, a Mau Mau terrorist fighting British rule of the colony is captured. Two native policemen bring in one of the top leaders of the rebel tribesmen, 34-year-old Dida Kamasi.
By 1956, the Mau Mau had been defeated. But it was becoming clear to British officials that they couldn't go on protecting the white minority, 1% of the population, in the face of African demands. They knew they'd have to make concessions or risk another rebellion.
Africans ready to and experienced enough to take over the actual administration of government yet?
Yes, they are, certainly.
Do you expect that they will do that, or do you want British civil servants to stay and help?
Oh, we want the help. We want the friends. Those who can work under an African government. We want them. But what we don't want is masters.
A wind is ruffling the tawny pelt of Africa. Kikuyu, quick as flies, batten upon the bloodstreams of the veldt. Corpses are scattered through a paradise. Only the worm, Colonel of Carrion, cries, waste no compassion on these separate dead. Statistics justify and scholars seize the salience of colonial policy. What is that to the white child hacked in bed, to savages expendable as Jews? Threshed out by beaters, the long rushes break in a white dust of ibises whose cries have wheeled since civilization's dawn from the parched river or beast-teeming plain. The violence of beast on beast is read as natural law, but upright man seeks his divinity by inflicting pain. Delirious as these worried beasts, his wars dance to the tightened carcass of a drum, while he calls courage still that native dread of the white peace contracted by the dead. Again, brutish necessity wipes its hands upon the napkin of a dirty cause. Again, a waste of our compassion as with Spain. The gorilla wrestles with the Superman. I who am poisoned with the blood of both, where shall I turn, divided to the vein? I who have cursed the drunken officer of British rule, how choose between this Africa and the English tongue I love? Betray them both or give back what they give? How can I face such slaughter and be cool? How can I turn from Africa and live?
Derek Walcott was born on the Caribbean on the island St. Lucia in 1930. He was a celebrated poet and playwright. Although he was trained as a painter, he turned to poetry at a young age. His first collection of poems was a self-published collection that he handed out on the street. His breakthrough came in 1962 when he wrote In a Green Night. Poems 1948 to 1960, in which he celebrated the history of the Caribbean and also investigated the impact of colonialism on the region. During his long career, his poetry focused on language, power and identity. In 1992 he won the Nobel Prize in Literature. His work was described as a poetic ever of great luminosity, sustained by a historical vision, the outcome of a multicultural commitment. He died in 2017. The title is ambiguous. Something a far cry from can mean very different to, or it could indicate that in the distance there is a cry from Africa. The poem has 3 stanzas. Stanza 1 has 10 lines. Stanza 2 has 11 lines. Stanza 3 has 12 lines. The poem does have rhyme, but the rhyme scheme can only be described as irregular. The poet uses iambic tetrameter. What is meter? Meter is the pattern of stressed and unstressed syllables that creates the rhythm of lines of poetry. The units of meter are called feet. Feet have different stress patterns. An iamb is a foot with an unstressed syllable followed by a stressed syllable. There are other ways to create a pattern by stressing different syllables. Poetic meters are defined by both the type and number of feet they contain. Iambic tetrameter contains 4 iambs per line, the prefix tetra means 4. The poet is trying to understand his own history and questions the actions of his people. The problem is he doesn't really know who his people are. He is torn between the two groups. The poem starts in Africa. The Kikuyu freedom fighters have killed many of the white colonists, even a child is hacked to death with a machete in their bid for freedom for their country. The country that was a paradise is now scattered with corpses, black and white. The first 3 lines depict the poem setting on the African plain, or veldt. The nation itself is compared to an animal, perhaps a lion, with a tawny pelt. Tawny is a color described as light brown to brownish orange that is a common color in the African landscape. The wind is a possible reference to the famous speech by Harold Macmillan in South Africa after visiting the colonies. 1960.
The wind of change is blowing through this continent. And whether we like it or not, this growth of national consciousness is a political fact, and we must all accept it as a fact.
The word Kikuyu serves as the name of a native tribe in Kenya. The description and context immediately puts the reader in the middle of the Mau Mau uprising in Kenya. The Kikuyu is compared to flies. They are black, quick and difficult to catch. What seems an idyllic portrayal of the African plain quickly shifts. The Kikuyu are compared to flies, buzzing around the animal of Africa, who are feeding on blood, which is present in large enough amounts to create streams. Walcott shatters the image of a paradise that many associate with Africa by describing a landscape littered with corpses. He adds a sickening detail by referring to a worm or maggot that reigns in the setting of decaying human flesh. The worm's admonishment to waste no compassion on these separate dead is puzzling in that it implies that the victims, white and black, somehow got what they deserved. The mention of the words justify and colonial policy, when taken in context with the preceding 6 lines, finally clarifies the exact event that Walcott is describing, the Mau Mau uprising against British colonists in Kenya during the 1950s. Salients in this context mean the people that enforce the colonial policy. Where earlier the speaker seemed to blame the victims, he now blames those who forced the colonial system onto Kenya and polarized the population. They cannot justify their actions because their reasons will never matter to the innocent victims of the revolution. To them they are as expendable as the Jews during the Nazi reign. The speaker mentions elements of nature that have always existed. Africa had huge herds of wild animals. This thought makes the speaker justify the savagery of animals as natural, whereas in his view, civilized humans' cruelty is not natural, but inflicted to prove their superiority over others. Walcott shifts gears in these lines and returns to images of Africa's wildlife in a reminder that the ibises, long-billed wading birds, and other beasts ruled this land long before African or European civilization existed. The poet uses a centuries-old hunting custom of people walking in a line through the long grass and beating it to flush out prey. Killing, hunting and death have been a part of Africa since the beginning of time. Such killing for sustenance is set against the senseless and random death that native Africans and European settlers perpetrate upon each other. These lines are simultaneously pro-nature and anti-cultural. Animals kill merely for food and survival, but humans, having perfected the skill of hunting for food, and have extend that violent act of survival to other areas. I have to ask. Is it coincidence that the word red, past tense, is used and it sounds exactly like the color of blood? Is it a pun? Man always resorts to violence. They seek divinity by deciding who lives and who dies. Ironically, wars between people are described as following the beat of a drum, an instrument made of an animal hide stretched over a cylinder. Peace has never been the result of compromise with an opponent, but a situation arrived at because the opposition has been crushed and cannot resist anymore. The poet calls the fight a dirty cause. He indirectly condemns both the colonists and the freedom fighters. He stated that this has happened before by referring to the Spanish Civil War. The gorilla, an animal of Africa, thus representing Africans, fight Superman, the white superpowers, perhaps. Primitive versus modern. One way of life versus a different way of life. One side fighting for survival. The other for dominance. Or preservation, but which is which? The speaker is a descendant of both Africa and Europe and doesn't know whom he should support. He ends with a series of questions that highlight his dilemma. He wants to both of betray them, and he will fight against both of them. He cannot agree with the actions of either party. These lines appear to be aimed at those judging the Mau Mau uprising from a distance, observers who could somehow accept brutality as necessary and who are aware of a dire situation but wipe their hands or refuse to become involved in it. The poet appears to condemn such an attitude by comparing the Mau Mau uprising to the Spanish Civil War, 1936-39. The whole Europe simply ignored it. Ironically, only Nazi Germany was involved, but the Spanish government remained neutral during World War II. Line 25 presents a cynical view of the Mau Mau uprising as just another colonial conflict where guerrillas fight with Superman. The battle seems unfair. The noble tradition versus the unstoppable. The word that sounds like guerrilla. A word often used to describe freedom fighters. A clever pun is used by the poet. This stanza is a change of scene from primarily that of Africa to that of the poet. Walcott, being a product of both African and English heritage, is torn because he does not know how to feel about the Mau Mau struggle. Walcott is poisoned by both. He feels that he was influenced by both. He certainly is not satisfied with the stock response of those from the outside. Walcott is sickened by the behavior of Mau Mau, just as he has been disgusted by the British. Should he turn away from both or seek revenge? Should he do what they taught him? Resort to violence to establish his identity? The two questions with which he ends point to the helplessness of his situation, and yet he is also African, so how can he turn away from it? These two questions link to the title of the poem. The poet paints a vivid image of post-colonial Africa. The poet uses this chapter of man's horrible past to share his own personal dilemma. The poet questions his own identity. He is of mixed race and seemed to have difficulty in associating with a specific group. Although one can look at the poem as just the perspective of a person with roots in two different races, the poem illustrates a far more universal truth. What is a unique cultural identity in the postmodern world? We are all in some way indifferent to our own cultural heritage.